Well, hello. It's great to see so many people. We've got 63 people signed in now, and I want to welcome everyone to the January 2021. It's been 10 months since we had a meeting, and I think most of you know who I am. And this is our first virtual meeting. This year is the 117th anniversary of the World's Fair, and it's a nice round number anniversary for our society, the 35th anniversary. And I know there's at least a few people, including sideways people sometimes, although it just corrected, signed in. Is that Phyllis? Oh, she's probably muted. You're straight now. It's the 35th anniversary of our society this year, and I hope later this year that we can all get together and have some real good times. So tonight's a very special meeting. It's a first-time presentation about a new book by Nancy Hardesty, who you'll all meet shortly. And I also want to thank Matthew Felix, Nancy's publisher, for hosting this Zoom meeting and helping everyone through it. And we'll probably repeat the things when we get to the end about the different views and stuff. I normally ask for new attendees to introduce themselves at our meetings, and there's a few of those all the time, but I'm pretty sure we got some people who have never attended a society meeting. So briefly, I want to tell you about the World's Fair Society. Established in 1986 as a nonprofit organization, we promote the memory of the World's Fair. We publish and send out a monthly bulletin. And guess who's on the cover this?
Woohoo!
Good timing, Nancy. And we publish and send that out monthly. We host monthly meetings. The past 6 or 8 months, we've been doing electronic meetings, sending out a PDF instead. We also present informational programs and do many other efforts. So if you are interested in joining the 1904 World's Fair Society, you can visit our website, which amazingly is www.1904worldsfairsociety.org. Just a couple of announcements. First, be sure and silence any cell phones so that they don't ring. An occasional dog barking or photobombing by pets is certainly acceptable. Pictures are allowed. I normally say that. Be sure and visit our society website that I just mentioned and our Facebook group page regularly. In particular, the website provides information about our meetings and also has several years worth of meeting photos and pictures. I want to make sure all the society members have received your January bulletin that I just showed. If you haven't gotten it, please get in touch with us. The mail sometimes is taking 2 weeks to send something that normally takes about 2 or 3 days. One other news item, our renewals for 2021 are going pretty well. There's still about 70 or 80 members who have not yet renewed. So your very last bulletin will be the February issue, and it will come complete with a renewal certificate. It will also have a last issue sticker on it and a renewal form. So help us keep the memory of the fair alive. So now, just prior to the program, I want to set the stage for Nancy and tell people a little bit about fair history of 117 years ago. January 26, 1904 was a Tuesday, just like today. And oh, by the way, 1 year ago today, we all met at the History Museum for a Fairest Wheel program. So in 1904, the fair would open in about 3 months, and the pace of working the final construction details was accelerating in spite of some inclement weather and some snowfalls. Thousands of construction workers were working to finish the palaces and the many state and foreign buildings, and construction on the pike was frenzied. Work on extending news articles from the newspapers. They were extending and improving the St. Louis and Suburban Railroad service, which was progressing well. It normally had ended at Union Avenue on Lindell, and now they were going to extend it all the way out down to just east of De Bolivar near the Wabash train station and the fair's main entrance. They anticipated serving up to 10,000 riders per hour. A gentleman from Japan arrived in San Francisco, Kiyoshi Sugawa, the director of their exhibits, on his way to St. Louis. He said the Japanese emperor and businessmen were eager to show Japanese resources and products to the United States. He put a value on their exhibits of about $3 million. However, in a few weeks, Japan would end up attacking Russia as they tried to negotiate a neutral zone, so to speak, and Russia withdrew from participating in the fair, which created some exhibit space and a building plot that were used. Japan was allocated much of the space that had been allocated to Russia. And finally, you've heard this before if you were at the History Museum a year ago, C.W. Dobbins of Hattiesburg, Mississippi, was seeking to exhibit his son on the Pike. Now, the World's Fair wanted to avoid sideshow type exhibits and just have educational and commercial type things, not just sensationalistic. So Mr. Dobbins' 12-year-old son weighed 228 pounds. His father said he knew of a girl in Hattiesburg about the same age and size, and he could arrange for her exhibition as well. Needless to say, that offer was not accepted. So, moving on to our program, I want to remind attendees that if you have any questions for Nancy during or after her presentation, please enter them into the Zoom chat panel. And if you just signed on in the last 10 minutes or haven't found it yet, if you put your cursor over the bottom part of your screen, you'll see a bar with some icons. The chat window is a little comic strip balloon, a word balloon. And if you click on that, you'll see a new panel come up to the right of the main Zoom window, and it'll be labeled chat. And, you know, there's a place at the bottom of that window that you can type your question. And I'll be keeping track of those for Nancy to ask at the appropriate time, probably after her meeting. So, Nancy Meneses Hardesty is now a New Society member and a published author. She was born in Jacksonville, Illinois, which is up towards Springfield, and was raised for most of her school years in St. Louis. She moved to San Francisco in 1969. Finding and going through family heirlooms and journals and artifacts, and with the help of her mother, she spent 6 years researching and writing the story of her grandmother, Blanche Estelle Spencer. She produced a fascinating story of a young woman's life and adventures in the early 20th century. And Matthew will now transfer control of this presentation over to Nancy.
Okay, I just do that, right, Matthew?
I have just given you the power. You are now in control.
All right. Am I in full screen when I'm speaking?
That depends on individual settings. You can't control that. So yeah, you don't have to worry about that.
Well, welcome everybody. My name is Nancy Meneses Hardesty. I feel like I'm in Reva Davis's kitchen having a cup of coffee. It's wonderful to know that there are people here who know my mother and father. Let me just start out to say that Charlie Meneses taught me to write and taught me the love of music. Those are both in the book. And Mary Kay Meneses is the one that figured out that Blanche Estelle Spencer was an orphan train child. So from there, we're going to start. I'm going to give you 3 show and tell items before I get into my slide presentation. The first item here is this little book. Can everybody see that? So this is the 118-year-old diary of my grandmother. As you can see, there are pictures of hats in here. Now, I actually had started writing the story of my grandmother before I found this book, but I found it in a chest in St. Louis in Mary Kay's house. You can see that it has pictures of hats in it. So it is full of hats and hat information about assembling hats and other information. I'm going to give you more information about this diary in the slideshow, but I wanted to see it for real because it is 118 years old. The back is worn off. It has seen a lot of miles in the states of the Midwest. Now from this book, we come to this one. This is the book that I wrote that was published in September of 2020. So I named the diary the Bonnet Book, and I have also named this book the Bonnet Book. And if you can see here, the background on the cover of the book is a page from the diary, and there are 3 hats shown on the front here. We worked very hard to put the cover on here because I'm so proud of my grandmother's work, and it is indeed the spine of the entire story. On the back of my book is the picture that I just showed you of the actual diary. Now I want to show you one more item before we start the slides. We're going to be talking about hats today. This is a hat that would have been developed in the period around the time of the book. This is called a French riding hat, and it is made by a French woman who lives in Texas. I just want to give you a little information about hats, and then we will start on the story. Notice that this is a piece of white felt here, and it is white felt on the inside. The techniques that my grandmother learned when she went to hat making workshops were how to embellish the plain hat. So the plain hat is called a pattern hat, and that book will come up later. So what this person has done, they've put blue fabric on top of the white, they've put lace on top of that, they've put silk flowers here, a fancy feather in the front, and a big tulle bow in the back. Now this is indeed a riding hat, and this is the kind of hat that was made for the women who were riding in the Oklahoma State Fair in 1910, and that's one of the chapters of the book. So my grandmother became a hat maker and was making hats like this and much more complicated hats. Okay, that's the end of show and tell. Now I'm going to switch to the slides. This is Blanche when she was in her 20s. I want to give you just a little background information about the beginning of the story. Blanche was 14 years old when she was suddenly torn away from her family, put on a train, sent to St. Louis, Missouri with other orphans, and landed in Union Station. She was picked up by the Roby family with whom she spent the better part of 10 years. This is the setting in America at the time the story begins. The Orphan Train Children Across America was between 1859 and 1929. The major transportation across the country at the time was 1869 was when the golden spike occurred and the railroads were now transcontinental across the country. Blanche was born in 1888. In 1894, Union Station was completed, and in 1902 was when Blanche was put on the orphan train. She departed from Murfreesboro, Illinois. She also received the 2 little books in 1902, one of which I just showed you, the diary. In 1904, she attended the World's Fair. In 1910, she attended the Oklahoma State Fair, which was on October 4th. Also in 1910, on October 6th, a man who wanted to court her, Charles Meneses, came to Oklahoma. She married this man in 1911, and later they had a wedding reception in Cobden, Illinois, and the Bonnet Book was produced in 2020. This is the 118-year-old diary that I just showed you. You can see that there are pictures of hats on the page here, and there is writing. Additionally, this book contains 25 sketches of hats, about 22 pictures of hat notes, and then in addition to this, there are lists of supplies that she carried in her wooden trunk when she was making hats for the people on the prairie of Oklahoma. Now I want to begin to show you some of the research. There are 3 journals that I used to write this book. The first journal I just showed you, that is her journal, and I called that one the Bonnet Book Diary. This is the second set of historical records from my family. This is the writing of Vivian Parrish, who was Blanche's niece. Vivian actually occurs in chapter 16 of the book. As you can see here, she did many pages of typed notes all about Blanche Spencer. I have 10 or 12 pages like this, which she typed up during the 1970s. These are the journals of Mary K. Meneses. Mary K. Meneses is my mother, and she was the daughter-in-law of Blanche Spencer. Mary was married to Charlie Meneses Jr. in about 1943, and soon after that, Blanche started telling her stories about her youth, which is the story of this book. Mary Kay just recorded these in her mind. She quickly had 3 children and became a school teacher. Near retirement, she began to take courses in recertification. She took writing courses and wrote down all of the stories of Blanche Spencer. This is an example here. This is about the little trunk. This is a picture of Mary Kay Meneses when she was 93 years old. She was with me during the entire time. She traveled with me to sites. We visited sites for the book. The most interesting thing was that I would interview her when I wasn't talking to other people. And even at age 93, her memory was very sharp, and she became the most interesting person that I interviewed for the book. I wanted to give you a little bit of information about the Orphan Train program, which occurred between 1859 and 1929. The program was first started by a Reverend Charles Loring Brace, who was a Methodist minister. He wanted to get children off the streets of New York City. He negotiated with the railroads to ship a child across the country for $15. He started this program around 1859, and soon the nuns of the Foundling Hospital, a Catholic group, hooked on to the same program and also started shipping children across the country. Between 1859 and 1929, approximately 300,000 to 350,000 children were shipped across the country from New York to as far as the Mississippi River. Later, this was called the Orphan Train program, and it was labeled as the largest child migration program in the world. Just a little bit of information about how this program in general applied specifically to Blanche Spencer. In our family records, in the records that I showed you, she was sent away in a white dress. It was very similar to what we see here. So she was in a white dress with white stockings and white shoes. And just before these children arrived at a station, the girls were given new white bows to wear. This is a picture from the Children's Aid Society, which was the Charles Loring Brace group that sent the children across the country. Sometimes the children were lined up in a group such as this to get on the train. You can see that once again, the girls are in all white dresses. The boys are in suits with short pants. Children up to age 16 were shipped, and Blanche Spencer was 14 years old when she was on this train. I visited the Transportation Museum outside of Kirkwood, Missouri, and looked over many trains out there, and I fell in love with this, the Wabash engine, which had been restored by a local group of train buffs. Around the same time, I met a man named John Shantz. John is a retired lawyer, and he also helps people find their lost orphan train relatives. He did research this Wabash engine for me, and it went up and down the state of Illinois for many years, and it almost becomes a character in the book in chapter 4. This is the station from which Blanche departed. This is Murfreesboro, Illinois. I visited this, but I could not get in the station because it was nailed shut. There was a contractor doing renovation work on the station, but I did see the stained glass windows here, and I knew that Blanche would be affected by these. She loved color and she loved fabric, and the stained glass windows occur in chapter 3 in the book. This is the station where Blanche arrived. This is Union Station, Grand Hall in St. Louis, Missouri, which was completed in about 1894. Notice how big it is. It's about 9 stories tall. I wanted to take a picture from down low so that we could see the view from a child, a young person looking up. There were angels on the wall carrying lights almost as high as heaven. There were black lights around the border. There were hundreds of chairs. There were trees with lights on them. And all of these children were overwhelmed as they came into the grand hall. Blanche went from here with the Roby family and stayed with this family for the better part of 10 years. Now I want to begin to pull you in to the chapter of the World's Fair. I wanted to show you the locations that the Roby family lived just around the time of the fair. Their first address was up here on West Bell Place. Those buildings have now been taken down. They were apartment buildings for 6 families. Next, they moved to the corner of Kings Highway and McPherson. And this was 5259 McPherson. Then they moved down the street to number 3 here, which was 4926 McPherson. Now remember that address because it comes up later in the story. Next, I wanted to point out the K, the letter K, the red K. That's 5263 Delmar, and that is the address of the Keys Marshall livery. This is the livery stable that probably rented horses and carriages to the Roby family. And remember the Keys name because this occurs later in the story also. Next, we go down to the E, which is the entry of the World's Fair. The family went in the summer of 1904. They did not go at the early period of time. This is approximately the trip that they took around the fair, and I'm going to be referring to this in the next few slides. They came in at the entrance, which was not real fancy. There were low buildings here. They went inside here and went past the Wabash building. The Wabash building appeared very fancy to Blanche. Perhaps it was not gilded, but it had fancy decorations, flags whipping at the top. And this was the area where people came in to the fair who were taking the train. From this point forward, I think Blanche was overwhelmed by the fair. She was overwhelmed by the many people, the fancy dresses, the fancy buildings of the fair, everything so very different from her town of Oroville of 100 people in the cornfields of southern Missouri. The family went first to view the Grand Basin, which is right here. I wanted to point out to you that the Des Peres River was put underground in this section of the fair in order to create the smooth and safe fairgrounds for the fair. Mike sent me this slide, actually. The blue line, which goes across the center here, shows the original alignment of River Des Peres under the fair, and the red alignment shown near the bottom shows the current alignment of River Des Peres. They first landed at the Grand Basin, which had the festival hall up above. As you can see, there were many dramatic fountains, waterfalls, just a lovely sight, all the fresh water in the middle of the park, and this became the visual focus of the fair. Now, if you'll notice the people down in the bottom left of this picture, you see many women in white blouses and dark skirts. I wanted to point out to you that I wanted the family and Blanche to come to the fair, but I didn't want them to be fancy dressed. And remember, she did not know her hat making at this time. So they were just in maybe go to church Sunday clothes, but not in real fancy clothes as they started their visit to the World's Fair in 1904. First, they went to the Fairest Wheel. This was a huge Ferris wheel. The parents chose not to go, but all the children wanted to go. The carts on this fair were huge, holding almost 100 people. They did not sway, as I showed in my book, but they just rode gently up and over the curve of the wheel. Now imagine how excited Blanche and the children of the Roby family would be when their cart stopped on the top. I am sure Blanche had never seen anything as exciting as this in her entire life. She was very upset that her father sent her to St. Louis, but I think when she was up on top of the Ferris wheel, she began to realize why he had sent her to St. Louis, to see a bigger world and to see more history. Next, they went to the Floral Clock. They just drove by, but were able to see this as one of the largest clocks in the world. The two hands of the clock are around 50 and 75 feet long. Mike helped me find one of your old lectures, which gave me the names of the flowers in the clock. The center circle here would have been purple with verbena. The outer ring here was with centaurea, which was a light blue color, and the numerals of the clock itself were done in coleus. If you know coleus, it has red and green and yellow and bright colors in it, so the numerals must have been quite significant. Next, they went uphill here. They went up behind the art museum and they caught a speech in progress. Originally in the book, I showed Annie Oakley giving a speech, but that is my mistake. Annie Oakley was actually not at the fair. She was at the Chicago Fair before this in 1893. However, there was a sharpshooter named Plinky Topperwine at the 1904 fair, and she quoted several things that Annie Oakley said. This is significant because later Blanche needs to shoot a gun, and she is encouraged by the speech of Annie Oakley. From there, they went up to the flight cage, which was near the top of the hill. I originally lived near the fair site on a street called Art Hill Place, and I went into the area of the zoo as a child. As a matter of fact, my first word was ampu, which is short for elephant. I remembered being in this tunnel. I originally said it was concrete, but it is a wire tunnel, as you can see here. One stood in the tunnel and looked at the birds in this very long and very large flight cage. It was the largest in the world at the time it was built, and it is perhaps still the largest one. For the last destination on their trip to the fair, they went down to the manufacturing palace. Mr. Roby had to visit business clients in this fair, and Blanche was turned loose to explore on her own. And this is what she found. She found the Rosenthal Sloan millinery booth. You can see the picture, you can see the name up here at the top. Now, I'm sorry that these are bad pictures. These are the only two pictures we can find on the internet. We even had Google look for us, and we cannot find better pictures. But I wanted to point out to you several things in these pictures. In the back, you will see that there is a map. The map shows the United States, and the map is made with silk flowers. In the foreground and all around the booth are pictures of hats. In the story in chapter 11, Blanche is just simply spellbound by all the hats she sees, and she is down on her hands and knees, looking at the hats, figuring out how they are made. She is completely memorized, and she's on the very first step of her life changing. So I believe that the Rosenthal Sloan booth, the pictures of the hats, gave her a sense of the career that she was about to have. Therefore, the 1904 World's Fair began to change the course of Blanche's life. The Rosenthal Sloan exhibit was the only millinery exhibit at the fair. At the time of the fair, this was one of the largest firms in the world distributing supplies for making hats. That would be feathers and braids and ribbons and other things that would go on hats, as I explained to you earlier. Rosenthal Sloan won a millinery award for their booth, and they would have been given a gold medal like this and a certificate like this. These are just examples which Mike sent to me. These are not the actual ones from the Rosenthal Sloan group. Soon after they won their award, they began to advertise gold medal hats, and this is their advertisement on the cover of a cookbook. Now, I want you to keep this hat design in mind because we're going to see that a little later in the slideshow. This is the picture of a postcard that was in Blanche's estate. This is the Rosenthal Sloan building at 1700 Washington Street. We believe that this is where her hat workshops occurred. Blanche visited this building and she saw hats on the outside of the building, or she saw designs on the outside of the building, and she fancied that they represented the hats. This is a picture that Mike sent me from today. Rosenthal Sloan now has the address of 1706 Washington, and it is listed in the National Historic Registry of Historic Buildings. Okay, now I want to take you back into the story of the Bonnet Book just after the visit to the World's Fair. The things that happened in the World's Fair lingered in Blanche's mind. Mr. Roby had made a decision when he saw her in the booth that he would try to get her into a hat making program. So at the beginning of 1909, she entered the lobby of the Rosenthal Sloan building, which is this building here. Notice the hat that the map that you saw earlier is shown here on the wall, and the women are dressed in very fancy clothes and very fancy hats. So Blanche went into the building for her workshops and passed this entry every day to and from. Now we begin the rest of the story, and I just wanted to point out to you the many other pieces of research that I did. I hired a woman from Southern Illinois named Dr. Susan Whitemountain, and she helped me dig into further research venues to help me put together the spine of the story. This is one of the census documents we found, and the Roby family is listed at the bottom of this document. From a census document like this, you could determine who lived in the house, what other relatives were there, and even the names of the servants. Additionally, I used other census documents to determine Cobden residents in the Phillips house, rooming house where she stayed, and I also used census documents to find the Keys family. Now remember the Keys name, it's going to come up again. After Blanche finished her hat making workshops at Rosenthal Sloan, she was sent on an apprenticeship to Cobden, Illinois, and she stayed in the Phillips house boarding house. I had an interview with a woman in her 90s named Mrs. Allie Jane Phillips. She was the great-granddaughter of Allie Elizabeth Phillips, who was the original proprietress of the store. This can be found in chapter 15 of the book. Now, at the time that she was living here, we found a census document listing her in April of 1910 in the Phillips house. So remember that date, April 1910. This is the only millinery store in Cobden, Illinois. We could not find any information, any register that she was a worker here, but I have made an assumption that she was, since it was the only hat store in town. It's kind of drab, it's got gray walls, it's got one overhead light, and it's somewhat primitive. If you go to chapter 15 in the book and go forward from there, you will see how Blanche brought her big city skills from St. Louis and began to modernize this shop and make it more welcome to the people of Cobden, Illinois. While she was in Cobden, she met Charles Meneses. He is the top person in this photo here, and that happens in chapter 15. I'm not going to tell you any more about how they met. My mother thinks they met at a church supper, and you have to dive into chapter 15 to find out about how that occurred. I just wanted to bring you up to date on the geography of what's happening in the story. Blanche was born in Oroville, Illinois. She was sent from Oroville to St. Louis. Then she was sent down to Cobden, Illinois for her apprenticeship, then back to St. Louis. Then she took a train called the Katy, which took her from St. Louis to Kansas City, down through Kansas to Muskogee, and then over to Oklahoma City. This is another very interesting piece of research that Dr. Whitemountain found for me. This is a newspaper ad from 1909 from Oklahoma City. Notice the name here. This is Archibald Keys. This is the same man who was running the original livery stable, the Keys livery stable up in St. Louis. Apparently he moves to Oklahoma City in 1909. Now we looked him up in the census documents, and Archie was 86, but he had a 28-year-old wife. I had those dates, those ages in the book, but my publisher made me take them out. He thought they were unbelievable, but I did not think so. I kept all this information in my file, and these facts kept juggling around and inspiring me. And here's the conclusion that I came to. The 28-year-old wife of Archie Keys, her original name was Daisy, but I named her Ruby in the book. She was 28, and she became friends with Blanche. We know from my mother's writings that when Blanche was in Oklahoma City, she had a pony and a cart. So I researched the two men in America who were working on cart restoration. One of them was down in Santa Barbara, and I took a train down and spent 3 days with this man in Santa Barbara. Now, the cart that I chose, that I felt was the cart she would have carried, was this one, which is called the Meadow cart, and she carried it, and it was drawn by a pony named Daisy. Now, notice this cart has a solid front that's a mud guard. On the one in the book, there were slats across the front. And notice that there's a space in the back where a board could be put down to carry a suitcase. In the case of my grandmother, she carried this trunk on the back of that Meadowbrook cart. Now, this trunk is still in existence. It has been renovated from its original form, and it's in my mother's condominium out in Kirkwood, Missouri. Just want to show you a little bit about this trunk. When I showed you the physical examples early in this show, I showed you a typical hat that would have been made by my grandmother. There would have been room for folded supplies in the bottom of the trunk here. There would have been room for 2 stacks of pattern hats on each side here, and room in the middle for a stack of the small little girls' hats. These pattern hats would have been unadorned. In the top here was a 2-inch layer with a broad shelf. In this shelf, Blanche carried all of her other hat making supplies. There would be feathers, parts of birds, braids from Paris, many, many kinds of ribbon, other little design sets of berries, and bunches of silk flowers. These were all used in her hat making campaign out on the Oklahoma prairie. We found this advertisement also in an Oklahoma newspaper. This is at 211 South Harvey, and this is Maison Francais, French millinery shop. We believe that this is where Blanche worked, but in the book I changed this to the name Paris Hats. Now, the reason I believe this was her store was because the Prince Rupert Hotel was only 2 blocks away from 211 South Harvey. Now, I wanted you to look back at this. This is the ad from the 1904, the cookbook ad, which shows the Rosenthal Sloan gold medal hats. And this is the French millinery ad in the newspaper. Now, notice the change. This is an elaborate and lovely hat in 1904. And by 1910, hats were even more dramatic, bigger, wider in size. And these would have been the kinds of hats that Blanche would have been making for the women in the grandstands. Now, I want to tell you a little bit about the Oklahoma State Fair. I just want to bring you up to date here. This fair occurred in October of 1910. The night was designated as a night for ladies. All the women horse riders were women in fancy hats, and the women in the grandstand were also in fancy hats. And my grandmother had worked on a 5-month campaign to make many, many of the hats for the festival. But I want to show you what happened here. This is a photograph from 1912 when the fair occurred again, but this is very special for you to see. I am just thrilled to be showing you this photo. This is the actual photo from the actual day of the opening night on October 12th of 1910. You can see the ladies in their fancy hats. Here is one here. There are 2 ladies up here in fancy hats. There are 2 back here in fancy hats, and there are 2 more over here. Now, here is what happened in my book. I was ready to use this photograph in the book, but I could not find the provenance for it, the original place that it came from. I had made 2 trips to Oklahoma City to do research for my book. A wonderful man had helped me and brought me a flurry of things. Somehow I didn't document where this slide came from, this photograph came from. I recontacted the Historical Society. They spent 2 weeks looking and could never find this. The original man who helped me was out on medical leave and not available. So the last picture, this one, is the one that occurs in the book, but I'm excited to show you this one because this is the actual photo of the day that represents the opening night, chapter 20 in the book. There are a few more adventures that occur in the book after opening night. You're going to have to get into the book to see those. But by the time we get to chapter 23, there is about to be a wedding. There's a reference in the journals about a wedding dress with a crocheted top. We don't have that original wedding dress, of course, or even a photograph of it. But I found this one in the St. Clair, Illinois Historical Society Museum, and I embrace this as the one that she wore on her wedding day. And you can read about this in chapter 23. Now, I told you to remember the 4926 McPherson Street address. This is the third house that the Roby family moved to and eventually bought and stayed in. When I was researching the book, we had spent a whole morning down in Union Station, and my mother took me to Llewellyn's Pub out in the West End. Maybe many of you know that pub. While I was eating lunch, I remembered that there was a letter in my file addressed to Blanche in St. Louis. I called my husband on my cell phone. He looked it up, called me back, and said that the letter was addressed to Blanche at 4926 McPherson Street. Well, we had the rest of our lunch, then we walked back to our car. Now, don't forget, my mother is 94 years old and still walking to the car with me. The shot you are looking at is where we were parked. We were parked right beside the 4926 Street address. Mary Kay knew the real estate agent on the front, and we later contacted her. We could never get into the building because the owners were living out of state. The building has now been renovated inside to 3 condominiums and doesn't look historic at all. But I modeled the inside of the building from the house of my nephew, who now lives on the south side of Forest Park. This is the final picture that occurs in the book. This is the wedding picture of Blanche and Charles Meneses. Here they are in a cart. On the cart, it says, "We're married now." Just behind Charles is his mother. And this is the mother of Blanche, her 2 older sisters, her younger sister, Grace, her younger brother, Merwin, in a suit with short pants. And in the back is her older brother in his army outfit. And this, they were married actually in Muskogee, Oklahoma, but came back to the town of Cobden and went down to the train station, which was a historic building, and had a photograph before they went to the church for the wedding reception. I just wanted to show you the history of the family. This is Austin and Lucretia, who are the parents of Blanche. Here she is in the line of 8 children. 2 boys ahead of her died in childhood. This is where Vivian occurs. Vivian was the daughter of Bertha. Vivian was married to Leonard, and Vivian wrote the journals, some of which are referenced in the book. Here is Charles Meneses, married to Blanche. Here is my father, Charles Jr., married to Mary Kay, and here am I and my brother and my sister. Several times when I have given this workshop, people have asked me if I actually knew my grandmother, and so I put this picture in to show you. This is my grandmother at age 94. She and I both were in St. Louis visiting my parents' house. Here I am with my son, who's now 40, but he's probably 15 or 18 months old in this picture. Notice how straight her back is, and she's even in heels. This is 2 years before she died. In the book, I feature the native redbud trees, which were in the state of Oklahoma. When I traveled to Oklahoma the first time, I saw these lovely redbud trees, and the betrothal takes place among the redbud trees. My mother, Mary Kay, read the chapter, and she told me to find this picture and see what's in this picture. Well, the only 2 trees in the backyard of Blanche in Virginia, Illinois, are the native redbud tree of Oklahoma. So it must have been just coming down through my blood that I knew the redbud trees were very special to Blanche. Here she is. This is a final picture of her. She lived from 1888 to 1984. This is the end of the slideshow, which is the history of my making of this book. I just wanted to point out 2 things to you in this slide. This is a silhouette that was a cutout taken of Blanche when she went to a World's Fair or a state fair in Illinois. She took me to these fairs as a child, and that's part of the reason I was able to write the state fair chapter that's in the book. Additionally, I just wanted to encourage everybody in your group to look once again at your own family history. I've spent 6 years doing this, and I've had a wonderful time putting this story together. Who knows? You might find a hat maker, you might find a diary, you certainly might find an interesting story of your own family. Now I'm going to turn this back over to Mike and to Matthew for questions and answers. Thank you.
Well, this is Mike. Nancy, I want to thank you for a very interesting and informative presentation. I have two questions for you that I think people might find interesting. I learned a little bit when I first read the book. I had to look up orphan trains and learn about them, and I was amazed at how many tens or hundreds of thousands of children were taken from the big East Coast cities normally and put on trains to go west, where they would be taken in by various people for family support and help, and to help with the farm and stuff like that. And I found out from reading your book that wasn't the case with Nancy. She wasn't from the East Coast. She was from Southern Illinois near Murfreesboro. And basically her dad had arranged, and her pastor, I think, for her to be to a family in St. Louis. And she was put on an orphan train. Maybe not at the beginning, but in transfers and stuff like that, she ended up on an orphan train with a lot of orphans.
Yes, that is the case. Originally, all of the children were shipped over from St. Louis, but about halfway through, maybe around 1900 or just before that, other groups, orphanages throughout the Midwest, figured out there was a program that they could use where they could shift orphans around. And so probably the train that when my grandmother was on was what we would call a secondary orphan train. It wasn't the ones coming from New York City. Now, I want to tell you two facts. Many of the documents related to the orphan train transportation and names has been lost. If they were in little orphanages, if these places burned down or the records were lost, they cannot be found today. But if 300 to 350,000 were shipped across the country, there are still people in America today looking for their orphan train relatives. Now, I have developed a website. John Shantz, whom I mentioned, the lawyer who helps with this, I wrote a summary of the orphan train program, a 6 or 8 page summary in my website, which is listed in my book, and further information, which is current for anyone who wants to trace down more orphan train children. We have that current information in my website.
Which is NancyMenesesHardesty.com.
Right, thank you.
It's in your book, but we can also say it. Let's say it. Yeah.
Good.
NancyMenesesHardesty.com is the website.
Yeah, I typed in NancyHardesty.com and got there also. Is that the same website?
Yes, that was originally the name of the website, but there is a woman in Oregon named Nancy Hardesty, Nancy something else Hardesty, who was a minister who died. And I decided that I had to put my middle name in it so that people could always find me. So you can get to the website from NancyHardesty.com or NancyMenesesHardesty.com.
Okay, and there's a number of pages there and some good information, some of which you've covered tonight. Had a question from Alan Sharon Mercer, and they wanted to know why, and I'll add, or when, did Blanche become Bonnie?
Oh, good story. Okay, what you're going to hear you may not believe, but here we go. You asked the question. Nobody actually knows. And I had several scenarios written out about how this happened. I thought maybe it happened in bluebonnets in Texas. I thought maybe her husband did it for her. I had these scenarios written out, but let me back up a little bit. Do you remember in the beginning, I told you that all of the legal documents and the census documents and the diaries and the reports, those are all the fence posts in the story. So if you have that image in your mind, these fence posts go all the way through the book. Then everything else I got, I put up on shelves in my mind. The interviews, the photographs, the census names, the train routes, everything. And I would write a chapter, and every chapter would have a couple of fence posts in it. And then I would pull the groceries off the shelves to write the story. So I had several scenarios set up for how the name changed from Blanche to Bonnie. And they were sitting up here on the shelf in my mind. And do you know that my pen was flying across the paper, and Blanche got off that train in Oklahoma City, and a young cowgirl jumped down from her wagon and said hi. And Bonnie said, "Hi, call me Bonnie." And that's what came out of the end of my pen. And I did not have that scenario written up. So I don't actually know how it happened, but I do know that in the census document in Cobden, she was listed as Blanche Spencer, and in the Prince Rupert Hotel in Oklahoma City, she was listed as Bonnie Spencer. So, you know, did her spirit come down and push the end of my pen? I don't know, but that's how it came into the story.
Good story, and I like that. While I wait for another question, if anyone has another question to type it into the chat box, I have one more. Nancy, I found your fictional history story of Blanche going to the World's Fair and being left alone in the Palace of Manufacturers, where maybe she drifted off and she found the Rosenthal Sloan booth. And your story relates how she spent a little bit of time there and got maybe inspired. Could you tell us about that?
Well, once again, you guys are going to be a little bit surprised about all this. There were 6 or 8 or 10 times during the course of my writing this book during the last 6 years where I think that I had a visit from Blanche. It was either her spirit or her energy, or I don't exactly know what it was. When I was writing about when she was taking the workshops and she was first learning about fabric, I woke up one morning and this information was in my head about these different fabrics that I've never even heard of. And I ran into my desk in my pajamas and I wrote for an hour. And I think it was Blanche, Bonnie, and her spirit was sending me that information. And I think the same thing happened that day when I took her into the Rosenthal Sloan booth. I just felt that there was lightning at the end of my pen. I saw her sitting on the floor. I had those pictures of the booth. You couldn't really see the hats very well from the top. She wasn't very old. She was a bit of a character. And I just decided that she got down on the floor and studied those hats in detail and held her hands up and made movement with her hands. And she just got into the act of making hats before she even was in the workshops.
And she spent how many years making hats, do you think, roughly?
She was still making hats when I was a little girl. I was born in 1945, so 1950, she was still making hats. So they went to Virginia, Illinois in about 1914. They bought a store, a dry goods store. She started making it in 1910 to 1950. So she was making hats 50 or 60 or 70 years.
Wow. Wonder how many hats she made in that time.
I don't know. I have no idea.
Does anybody else have any other questions? Well, about now, if we were in a live in-person meeting, I'd say, how about another round of applause for everyone? You can wave your hands if you want. I thought it was a great presentation.
Nancy, could you make me host again, and I can unmute everyone and we can give her a round of applause. But Nancy, go over to my name and make me host.
To your name in the participants?
Go to my name in the participants, hover over more, and make me host again so I can also take care of the recording afterwards.
Hi, can you hear me?
Hi.
Hi.
Hi, Diane.
Hi, I want to say
Okay.
I've known Nancy for
I
about
don't
40
know
years.
I'm having trouble getting this.
Are
Hi,
you?
Diane.
Yeah, Nancy, just go over to my name, hover over more, and click on make host. Yeah, now I'm the host. Okay, so I'm going to unmute everyone. All right, so.
I started to write. Matthew, can you hear me?
Yeah.
I started to write that I've known Nancy for a really long time, and it's wonderful to read these stories that she's mentioned over the decades in this lovely book.
Very nice presentation.
Thanks, Bob.
Thank you for doing virtual.
And I have read the book.
Well, once again, you can go on Amazon.com and do a little bit of Googling for the Bonnet Book, searching for it, and you'll find it pretty quickly.
Well, and I actually put the link to the book, both to Nancy's page, the page on her website where she talks about the book. I also put an Amazon link in the chat, and I put the bookshop.org link as well. So all of the links are in the chat as well.
Who was it that said they read the book?
Sharon Mercer has read the book and it was delightful.
Oh, good.
And is your hat an antique?
No, it's not an antique. It's and it's from an era a little later than the book. This hat will come with me when I do traveling visits, and I bought it because it smashes down flat. Or travel. There's so many books there's so many hats in the book, and that's kind of the theme for the book. So I thought it was appropriate for me to wear a hat.
And there's another question in the chat, Mike.
From Carol Diaz-Granados. Is that Charlie Meneses, the one who used to be on the radio playing music and records?
Yes, that's Charlie Meneses. He was known as Cactus Charlie. He was on KMOX radio for 20 or 30 years. He did this in retirement. He did it until the day he died. He became crippled as a young man, and while he was lying on his back crippled, he learned jazz music when he was 15 years old. And then as he grew up, he continued to study jazz. And he wrote a lot of the dust jackets for the 78 LP record of very famous musicians like, I'm trying to think who they are, really famous. Famous trombone players and piano players.
Carol Diaz-Granados then typed in, when did he pass?
Oh, he passed before 2000, a little before 2000, like 96.
Okay. And for people that aren't watching the chat box, Shara Storm said, it's so nice to see everyone and to attend a meeting. I hope we have more like this, and we'll have one next month for sure. And the month after, and maybe things will get a little bit better.
Mike, I have thought of one more thing that I want to say.
Go ahead.
I've done 6 or 8 of these presentations now, and the most heartwarming thing for me is that people hear my story and then they begin to think about their family history and their story. And I'm very pleased that my book encourages people to look back in their own family history. You know, who knows, you might find a hat maker. So that's been a very interesting part for me. And in the future, I'm going to be doing a newsletter piece on other hat maker information that I am finding. So if anyone in this group has a hat maker in their history and a hat maker picture or a picture of a hat that your grandmother made, I would love for you to get in touch with me by email and send these to me because I'm collecting them and I will use them in a newsletter.
Okay, great. Cynthia Masterson posted a question that she wished she had gotten into the meeting before the presentation was over. I don't know if it was a time zone issue or what, but she asked where is the recording available? And Matthew said the video will be uploaded tomorrow, and I will give the link to Mike to distribute, which I will do. And it will also be on Nancy's YouTube channel. So if you go to, correct me if I'm wrong, Matthew, you go to youtube.com, search for Nancy Hardesty, you probably will find it.
Correct.
Nancy, I enjoyed your book.
I've read most of the book. It's very entertaining and informative, and a look back at over 100 years ago now. And I can't imagine what it was like as a barely a teenager to be put on a train by your family, go off to a new city, new family, and finish your growing up into a young woman. That must have been scary and good.
But
And
she pulled herself up by her bootstraps. That's what makes her so interesting and, an interesting character to write a book about.
I want to surprise Nancy with something here. First, I want to take a little poke. I think there's about 5 or 6 Mike Truaxes signed in. One of them, whom I see, yeah, the guy who just laughed there. Is that Roger?
Yeah.
Roger Greider with the big picture of the World's Fair behind him?
Yes.
Hey, how you doing?
Doing fine.
Not a problem. I don't know if this is the first time hosting or Zoom for a lot of people, so I hope we've all enjoyed it. Surprise for Nancy. So Nancy, if you'd say something so I can see your face, Nancy Hardesty.
Okay, I'm right here. Right here.
Okay, well, it's our tradition in the World's Fair Society to call people who have just finished a presentation up to the front of the room and give them a first-time presenters award. And what we give them is a paperweight with the World's Fair Society logo in it.
Oh, how lovely. How lovely. I just love your logo, and I'm very pleased to have that.
And that will go in the mail in the next couple of days to you. And I can't guarantee what the mail is going to do with it or how long it'll take to get there. But this will be a commemoration of your great presentation tonight.
Oh, great. Thank you. Well, I'm looking forward to staying in touch with this group. My heart's in St. Louis,
Right. And if you have any questions about the World's Fair and stuff, where to go. Nancy's site has just popped up in the chat room again, all the and stuff. But while we're all unmuted, I want everyone to give Nancy a round of applause that she can hear.
Good job. Good job. I enjoyed your book, Nancy.
Thank you very much. Oh, Marty, this is a college roommate of mine.
Yep.
Oh, great.
So you've read it now too.
Oh, yeah.
I want to get to the closing. And one of the things I do at closing, I do the 117 years ago at the beginning. And here's a quick update about some upcoming society meetings. Be sure and check our bulletin and the website, and we'll keep information posted there. They'll be announced and previewed in the society bulletin, and a reminder will be sent to our members about these meetings. On Wednesday, February 17th at 6:30 p.m., we'll host another Zoom meeting, and I'll hopefully figure that out how to do that between now and then. Or I might get David Meyer's help because he's been setting a couple of board meetings up for us over the last year or so. I'm going to give a presentation about World's Fair oddities. Now, some of you came to a meeting a year ago in February, which was part of Johnny Rabbit, Ron Elz's presentation about our own oddities, which was a St. Louis comic strip, kind of like Ripley's Believe It or Not. And he put together 5 or 6 people that gave presentations about different aspects of St. Louis. I got to do a World's Fair presentation. I'm going to expand that a little bit and show images and information about the World's Fair to show special highlights, unusual aspects, and perhaps some little known facts. Then on Tuesday, March 18th, we will meet again on Zoom at 6:30 for a new presentation. Sally Carter is from the Hahn Museum in Lafayette, Indiana, near Indianapolis. And who have read the bulletin regularly probably know that Hahn Museum occupies the original and relocated Connecticut building that was at the 1904 World's Fair. They run an Indiana kind of state museum there, and they have a special connection to the World's Fair. About every couple of years, they have a 1904 World's Fair Day to celebrate that connection. And they get some acrobats and food and performers, and they pull out some memorabilia, and they show stuff about the fair. So they consider themselves very well associated with the World's Fair. And Sally Carter is going to give us a presentation about Indiana at the fair. Once again, that's going to be Thursday, March 18th. And then as we go into April and May, we have some plans, and the program director's talking with other members of the board about, what we can do and when we can do it, and ideas percolating. But we'll keep everyone posted, the World's Fair Society members, through the bulletin and website and emails to our members. And for those of you who aren't members of the society, talk with Nancy. Matthew's learned a lot about it. He and Nancy sat through a abbreviated presentation about the World's Fair to bring them up to speed, and then hit me with about 10 or 15 questions. They were pretty amazed at what they built back in 1902 and 1903. So does anybody else have any questions now that we're all unmuted?
Mike, I have a question because when you were speaking a moment ago, you said that the March meeting would be on Tuesday, the 17th. And then a moment later, you said it would be on Wednesday, the 18th. So when is it? Because we all want to go.
I may have misread. The March meeting is Thursday, March 18th.
Okay, good.
For those
I'll
of
be
you
there.
who are checking me. Hi, Jana. Have you been here the whole time?
I came in just a minute late.
Oh, okay, good. You were one of those Mike Truaxes.
Yeah, I was for a while, and I'm prettier than you.
Well, Jana, I'm glad to see that you made it. I was taking notes for you, and I sure hope your hip continues a good recovery and that you're doing well.
I'm struggling along, but I'll get there.
Good. It's good to see you and see your smile and stuff. So you take care. Any other questions or inputs or thoughts from everyone to share with everybody?
Mike?
Yes.
Mike, this is Jay. For those who aren't familiar with Zoom, they can click on the name, or like the Mike Truaxes that aren't Mike Truax. They can click on, the individuals can click on the name and change it. So you hover the pointer over the name, and a little box will pop up to change the name.
That's in the participants list, which you have to turn on down by the chat.
And something else, if you're muted, you can just, and I'm doing it now, all you have to do is press the space bar and you unmute yourself temporarily. So you don't have to go fooling around with the corner mute and all that. You just, when you're muted, you can just press the space bar. It doesn't always work when the host mutes everybody, but if you mute yourself, you can just unmute by pressing the space bar.
Ah, okay. Some tips and
You
tricks.
can also change the names of the people.
Yeah, the host can, you're right.
Okay. Any other World's Fair questions or society questions or be aware of? Well, I hear somebody's alarm clock or
I thought it was the Mike Truax Witness Protection Program.
Well, folks, it's so good to see you all and, see some faces that we haven't seen in at least 10 months, if not a year or more. I hope you enjoyed tonight, and feel free to shoot emails either to the society that Holly will pick up or, directly to me or whatever. Holly, are you online? You want to say hi?
Hi.
Okay. We and your board are working to, try to get things going again. And, we'll do Zoom meetings for at least 2 or 3 more months, I think, but hopefully we'll be able to go to regular meetings not long after that.
Who won the door prize?
No attendance prize today. I couldn't figure out how to, draw random names, but I will get a list of attendees, and you never know what might pop up.
Mike, the way to do the door prize is that when people come in, when they sign in, the person who hosted the meeting assigns everyone a number. When they come in, like the first person that comes in is number 1, the second person is number 2. et cetera. And then you use those numbers to draw from a hat. For a
Aha.
drawing. I have another club where we figured that out.
Aha. Okay. That's a way we can do it next time around, maybe. And I saw, did I see Celeste waving, or was she raising her hand? Oh, she's raised her hand for a question. She's muted. You have to unmute yourself, Celeste.
I'm just saying hi.
Oh. Okay, with that, I want to thank Nancy Hardesty one more time for an interesting and informative and fun and good presentation. Wish her all the best, and hope you have fun learning more and more about the fair as we go forward.
I'll be in touch.
Okay,
Thanks
that sounds
again.
good.
Thanks.
We'll get that website for the recording out to everyone in the next few days.